sometimes research was introduced to practice that wasn't helpful to practitioners. So I began with working with 3 national advisory groups, including a national Māori Education Research Advisory Group and Pacifica Education Research Advisory Group, so that we could get agreed guidelines nationally about how we went about this. And in particular, the advice that I got was that the education practitioners themselves wanted a big role in the process. And that's when we designed not only the guidelines with the strict focus on what works in relation to valued student outcomes, social achievement outcomes, cognitive outcomes, a whole range of outcomes that the community is seeking from its education system, but also the process that we would use, so that representatives from our principals groups, our teacher unions and other stakeholders would be involved in the management of best development. And the theory of action was that in this way the stakeholders could say when the way the evidence was being brought together was speaking to them, when it wasn't, what their concerns were, when there were surprises in the evidence, how they might read it, so that the researchers, the policymakers and the stakeholders working together created a dynamic whereby the synthesis of evidence wouldn't just say what works and why, but would do it in a way that spoke to the concerns of teachers and leaders in education.
Fantastic. And there are really interesting parallels, but also some really, really important distinctions between that and how we got involved in systematic reviewing in England. For example, the new Labour government in 1997 decided to make research and evidence-informed practice a priority, and one of the things they set up was a national centre for designing methodologies for systematic reviews, which was called the EPI Centre, Evidence for Policy, Practice and Information, I think that is. And we had at the same time decided we wanted to do a systematic review about CPD that made a difference for learners, because we think that using research and evidence really is professional learning, and we wanted to know the evidence that should be informing everything we do in Cure. So we applied for and became one of the registered centres for these reviews, but the methodology was laid down by the technical centre, and the people who were running the centre came from a health background, in fact, and what they were wanting to preserve was a methodology that would enable people to read between evidence from education and from health and from crime studies and probation studies and so on. And so the methodology that we were being driven by all the time came from outside education. And we, like you, put together a group of teachers. We put together 30 teachers, 15 retired and 15 serving, so that the 15 retired teachers had more time to give us. And they had really strong views about how the review would be run, and we involved them in doing that. But we had to fight, for their views to get heard, and we weren't always successful in that. And so the systematic review process, for example, had 132 questions that were methodological questions, and the writing up of the reviews was completely specified page by page to enable read between education and other disciplines. And so we wrote our first report for our practitioners, and then we had to completely restructure it so that it met all the technical demands of the other disciplines. And then, therefore, what we had to do was completely rewrite the review after we'd finished it, so that it met the needs of practitioner audiences. And what we did was we created summaries, we created case studies, we wrote a whole series of much shorter versions, from a 1-page to a 4-page to a 10-page summary, where we hot linked every finding to teachers' own case studies. So we had to separate some of those processes, and I think, when I look at the Besses, sometimes I think it's it's almost like reading a poem, and it's a bit fancy, but you can just hear in every page how strong that practitioner voice is, and in our technical systematic reviews you just don't get that. You have to turn for all the extra things that we made, like the national framework for coaching and mentoring, to find the places where it speaks to the practitioner audience?
Well, it was quite tough.
Yeah.
I was really committed to a fit for purpose guidelines, and I worked with a philosopher of science to make sure that the rigour was there. Absolutely. And that we really understood how educational research, both quantitative and qualitative research, could serve our ends. I also looked at the literature on how teachers learn from research, and some of the work on the use of vignette that brings theory to life. And so the need for writers to try and aim to have at least a vignette on every page, and cases to bring it to life for teachers. And they became part of the management group, and they decided whether at each milestone whether the writers should be paid. And at that stage, those kinds of conversations that then involved the writers had everybody saying, well, this is where our perspective is, and then the policy people sitting around the table would say, well, these are our questions. And it was a very hard struggle, there's no doubt about that. My worst moment was when the president of one of our Principals Association sent an email to every school principal saying, we have to fight the best evidence synthesis, well, not in those words, but raising questions about it. Looking back, that was a very tough time from a policy organisation to have that happen. But what he did is laid out some of the arguments that were going on. Like, we're professionals, we know what we're doing. What role would research have in informing us? What if the people doing the research haven't had the professional experience? Would it ever be able to speak to our needs? And what that generated with a lot of heat was a really serious national dialogue about whether research could be useful. And now that Principals Federation have endorsed the leadership best.
Once you have the syntheses, you can use that to change the nature of the debate about the usefulness of research. You can't kind of do that in abstract if you haven't got these syntheses and no one knows about them, because no one can imagine what they could be. And for us, you know, we had to do all that difficult work subsequently after we'd done the technical report, and so we then went through many of those processes, and a lot of that was about creating something that you've written very excitingly about in your newest best evidence synthesis about leadership, this business of smart tools, that is, you know, protocols and practical instruments that practitioners can use to carry the research into their daily lives, but then also to test it for themselves and prod it and poke it and make it work for their students. And that seems to me to be the kind of summation of what these reviews are for. They're about changing the nature of the thinking about using research and evidence and creating practical protocols, resources, summaries, vignettes, all those different things that can carry the research between the two worlds in a properly serious and complex way.